I don't know what to say after an introduction like that. It's wonderful to see all of you again and to be here. I was sitting thinking about those who've gone before us and some of our elder pastors here now, Pastor Cagnate and Pastor Nick, and Pastor Willie Cruz and others. And I was sitting there thinking about how precious it is to see an example of long faithfulness. Long faithfulness. And what I would like to do tonight is introduce our subject, and then our opening message, Lord willing, will be short. And then I would like to show about a 12-minute video presentation of the long faithfulness of Dan and Dot Ebert, Pastor Bill and I's parents. And that story, I think, is every time I see it, is an encouragement to me. And I think for many of us, we know parts of the story, but we don't know the whole story. And this short PowerPoint that's overlaid with audio tells a story of long faithfulness. And while each of us, I think, when we examine our own lives, are aware of our own brokenness, our own failings, our own struggles, desire to be faithful. We want to be faithful to the Lord, not for a few years, but a long faithfulness. And so I hope that tonight, as we begin our conference and we introduce our subject matter, and then we reflect on the long faithfulness of some who have gone before us, that we will be encouraged to be faithful in the years to come. So, is it okay?
Dan and Dr. Roberts,
we'll do that afterwards. But it works. Thank you. Okay, we'll do this. So our topic for this year's conference is related to the subject of work. Last year, when we gathered together in the 2017 Bible Conference, we studied the theme of worship. And this year we want to turn our attention to the subject of work or vocation, what we do between Sundays. And Lord willing, we're still discussing this among the actual leadership. We're thinking next year of rounding out a 3-part series. So we did worship, work, and then possibly next year we will consider wellness, which is how God views our physical life as well as our spiritual life. What is a good theology of the body, a theology of creation? And so, Lord willing, we'll have done worship, work, and wellness, and then we'll stop with the W's and move on to some other topics. Most of our daily lives are not spent in corporate worship as God's people, but in the workplace that the Lord gives us. And for those of us in vocations of ministry, this may include much time, hopefully, in Bible study and prayer, time in working with people in evangelism or discipleship or church leadership. But for most people that are in our, see if I get this right, for most of God's people, they are not spending their days in the church, or their days in Bible study or in evangelism. They're spent in the office or in the factory or out in the field doing their regular work. Their vocation may be that of a student or a housekeeper or in a variety of other callings which God has placed upon their life. And we need to ask ourselves the question, how should the gospel impact the way we think and feel and act in our places of work? What does the Bible teach us about, it's not vacation, but vocation. What does the Bible teach us about vocation? Our lives lived from Monday to Saturday. Now this is important, an important topic for us to study. And along the way, we will learn that for the Christian, work is a form of worship. As we study together this week, may our lives in the workplace and in our understanding of vocation or calling be transformed for our good and for God's glory. So let me begin this with an introduction. And so the first thing I want to point out is that the subject of work is an ancient topic. It is one that we find, as we will see, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. We will also find that, and we will look at some of those subjects. If you're around Dr. Clem and I very long, you will find out that he is an Old Testament scholar or theologian, and my PhD is in New Testament studies. So we have some interesting conversations with one another. So he will cover some Old Testament passages on the subject of work and leadership. And then I will focus a bit on the New Testament. And we will find that they are perfectly married to one another. That we need both the Old Testament and the New Testament in our study of the Scriptures. But the early church fathers also had something to say about this subject. And I wanted to give a couple of examples of that, just so that we can realize when we study work as a Christian, we're in the path of the ancient church who thought about this subject as well. So let's consider just a couple of examples. In his letter, also called 1 Corinthians, but this is not the 1 Corinthians of the Apostle Paul, but that of Clement of Rome, who died around 102 AD, probably not too long after the Apostle John died. He wrote about work in terms of doing good. And we'll find that also in Titus and the pastoral epistles and elsewhere that we are to do good in our lives. And we'll talk about that, the difference between good works for salvation and doing good as followers of Christ. So he said, and we quote here, "What then shall we do, brothers? Shall we slacken from doing good? May the Lord never allow this to happen to us, but let us be diligent to accomplish every good work with earnestness and zeal. Let us follow out His will without hesitation. Let us do the work of justice with all our strength." And that's 1 Corinthians chapter 33, so you know that's not 1 Corinthians of the Apostle Paul, which only has how many chapters? 16? Is it 16? 15. In the same work, Clement wrote, "The good laborer receives the bread of his labor with confidence. The lazy and careless one does not look his superior in the face. We must therefore be zealous in doing good, for all things are from God." Then if we look a little bit further, there was an early discipleship manual written after the close of the New Testament called the Didache. Those of you who have studied Greek know the Greek word didasko is to teach. Didache was the teachings. It was perhaps a baptismal manual of discipleship. And in that writing, probably written, we're not sure the exact date, but before about 120, some say as early as 96 AD, we read these words, "But if he wishes," that is, a unbeliever comes and joins the Christian community, "if he wishes to settle among you and is a craftsman, let him work and eat. But if he has no trade," let's see if I can get caught up here. "If he has no trade, provide according to your conscience, so that no Christian shall live among you idle. But if he does not agree to this, he is trading on the name of Christ. Beware of such people." That is, if someone comes into the fellowship and becomes a part of the church and refuses to work and isn't able to work, then be careful of that kind of person, because the Lord expects us to be industrious and diligent in places of work. So not only the early church fathers of the early period, but a little bit later we have Basil the Great, who lived from 329 to about 379, and he taught, "It is therefore immediately obvious that we must toil with diligence and not think of our goal of godliness as an offer or as an escape." I think my clicker is not cooperating. Okay? But being a Christian or being a godly person is not a way to escape working. And we all know that, right? Why would you go into the ministry for an easy life? It is not easy, right? To become a Christian and to become a godly person implies that we will also work hard in the workplace. So it's not an escape from work or a pretext to idleness. In the midst of our work, can we fulfill the duty of prayer, giving thanks to Him who has granted strength to our hands for performing our tasks, and cleverness to our minds for acquiring knowledge, and for having provided the materials for that which is in the instruments we use, and that which forms the matters of the art in which we may be engaged. Praying, even as we work, that the work of our hands may be directed towards its goal. What is the goal of the work of our hands? According to this early church pastor, it is the good pleasure of God. When we move on to consider the reformers, just very briefly, these leaders taught that people in that time, the time of the Reformation, thought that if you had a call from God, this only meant one thing: you would become a priest. And that other people did not really have a call from God, only those in the priesthood. But the reformers helped us to restore an understanding that all work, everyday work, has dignity. This led to a new understanding of vocation. The word vocation comes from the Latin vocare, which means to call. So we use the word vocation and calling sometimes in the same sense. A vocation, as we will see, is a calling. The way we want to define it is a calling to serve God or others in a special way through their work. So we all work in many ways. You can work in the yard, you can work in the kitchen, we do all kinds of work, whether it's in employment or not. But when the Lord calls us to a kind of special work that becomes the main activity of our day, it is really a calling to serve God in that place and to serve other people. So we think of vocation that way, as understood in that light. So in the time leading up to the Reformation, there was this problem. The Protestants argued that any non-sinful profession could be a legitimate calling before God. So, non-sinful profession. So the profession of a prostitute, that's a sinful profession. Profession that is one of violence or doing evil is not a calling of God, but other professions are. you're a jeepney driver, or you're cleaning the street, or you're a nurse or a doctor. Those are legitimate vocations or callings from the Lord. Now, the next point that we want to make is that back this up just a little bit. I think I'm getting. I think this is a little bit out of place here. Something is wrong with the PowerPoint. I'm not sure what happened here. So I'm going to leave the PowerPoint aside. I'm not sure what happened, but there's a problem with it. So let me just talk you through the notes that we have remaining in our time. So if you I don't know how many of you have the handout notes, but we are on page 2 under the subject of a neglected or misunderstood topic. So what we have said so far is that this is an ancient topic, and we looked at it in that way. But we find in the recent past, this subject has either been misunderstood or neglected. And so I want to comment briefly on that. Most of us here at the conference are in a ministry as our vocation. And this too is work. We are also in a workplace. But we need to be sensitive to the reality that most of those that we minister to are in other places of work or vocation. Unfortunately, we can sometimes give the impression, a little like the pre-Reformation church, that only full-time ministry or the formal work of the church is truly a legitimate calling. So sometimes people think if they don't go into the ministry, they don't really have a calling from the Lord. And that is a mistake. And we need to be careful about giving that impression. This misunderstanding is sometimes referred to, and I need to correct the notes here, is sometimes referred to as the sacred-secular divide. That is, we give people the idea that some callings are sacred and some callings are secular. And the Reformers objected to that. They said that gives the impression that unless you're in the priesthood or the ministry, your calling is not a sacred calling or a holy calling. And we want to try to avoid that misunderstanding. And we'll try to come to a balanced perspective on that. Even if we do not hold that mistaken understanding, there can be a tendency to neglect helping God's people think Christianly about their life in the workplace. What happened, there's a problem with the slide, and the way I saved it. So I don't think we're going to find it. We have the expert helping us now. See, that's from a different presentation. So let me just fill out of that. There is a story behind this problem. Would you like to hear it? So, just go to the title slide. That's the email. So originally we were scheduled for 6 lectures, and then a 7th lecture was added for this evening. So we were preparing an introduction rather quickly the other day. And I prepared the handout notes, and I prepared my notes, and you have the handout notes. And I forgot to prepare the PowerPoint presentation. So this afternoon I was preparing it, but I was building it off of an earlier presentation. And I think what happened with this is I saved it in another place, and so what we called up here is a mismatch. That's a lesson. Always do your work early, always double check, and we were not able to do that at this time. So let's continue here. We are on page 3. We've talked about the neglect of this subject. And I don't know if you are aware in your own ministry, are you teaching those that you minister to what it means to be a Christian in the workplace? And is their word a calling from the Lord? And how should they think about it biblically and with good doctrine so that when they're working they have a confidence that what they're doing is really unto the Lord and a calling from the Lord? So what has happened in recent years, just in the last, I would say, maybe 5 years, 10 years, there has been a resurgence of interest and study on this subject. So a number of writers, organizations, schools, and ministries have begun to focus on this important topic. So I'll just mention a few of them that I'm aware of. There's a foundation in the U.S. called the Kern Foundation, and they have provided funds for Christian universities and colleges to study this subject. In other words, they will offer money so scholars will study the subject of the Christian in the workplace. There is an organization then that resulted from that called the Oikonomia Network. Oikonomia is from the Greek word that means economics. So economics is what happens in the workplace. And that is a network of universities, Christian universities and colleges in the United States, and scholars who publish papers and discuss this subject, and you can easily find them on the internet. And then along with that, there is an organization called Made to Flourish, which has been focusing on helping pastors to address this subject. So when I was working in Miami with Trinity International University, the Made to Flourish organization opened new branches in the Miami area. And so we got to know those folks, and what they were doing was gathering pastors together and saying, are you really teaching your people about their life from Monday to Saturday in the workplace and how to be a faithful Christian and to think about our work in that way? So there has been a lot of activity in that. And I think some of it is already coming here to the Philippines, and we will be hearing and seeing of those things. There are many publications as well as conferences, seminars, and websites devoted to this question. And I think this is largely a healthy development. You may be aware of an organization called the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. And they have a website. That's actually the work of Tim Keller from, what's the name of his church? Redeemer City Church in New York, in Manhattan. And there's a lot of good resources there. I think it's tifwe.org. And lots of resources there, articles and essays to help us think through the subject. But as Dr. Clem and I were preparing for this conference, we were reminding each other of how important it is in our work to view this subject, as all subjects, soundly grounded in the Bible and in good theology. And so we're going to try in our study, each of the lectures that we have ahead of us, to try to base our teaching on the Scripture about work and how we should think about it. So let me give a brief overview of where we will be going with this. Questions about work. There are a number of questions that we hope to answer along the way as we study this week. For example, how is the workplace different for the Christian than for the non-Christian? Can we think of our work at our jobs as serving the Lord? Is so-called secular work also God's calling upon our lives? What is the difference between work and vocation? So we'll try to define that. How does creation humanity's fall into sin, and God's saving purposes, how do those things relate to how we think about work and the workplace? And what is a healthy, biblical, or theological way to think about the workplace? So those are some of the questions and others that we will look at. So then, a theological summary statement. So Dr. Clem has been working on this, and he and I have been iron sharpening iron as we think about how do we express this and unpack it. So through our study, we're seeking to develop a careful summary statement of how we ought to think about the Christian life in relationship to work. So here's the statement, and throughout our lectures we'll try to explain and amplify its meaning. So the statement may not be clear to you right away, but hopefully by the end of the week it will make more sense. So here's the summary statement. Our work is an imitation of who God is and what God does. Our work is an imitation, no matter what it is, ministry or in the workplaces of the world. Our work as Christians is an imitation of who God is and what God does. Now I'm going to edit just a little bit, so if you're following in the notes, you want to make a little correction. Okay, after that, period, what God does, period, we work for His glory, the benefit of all others, and the advancement of His, God's objectives for His people and the whole creation. Although living in a fallen world, people through the gospel co-labor with God in creative and recreative ways in all life's work and vocation. So we'll be expanding that. What do we mean creative and recreative ways? Well, God creates. Right? Then the world falls into sin, and what does God do? He brings about a new creation, a recreation. So if we're going to be an imitation of who God is and what He does, then we can think of our work in these two ways. Our work is either creative. You can think easily of an artist or someone who's building something, or other ways, creating, making good of God's creation. Or where there is sin and brokenness and alienation from God and conflict, we are working with God through the gospel to bring about the new creation. And we'll talk about that and how to think about that properly and to avoid some errors. So what will our individual topics be? Along with some devotional morning messages, our series will address some of what both the Old and New Testaments teach about work. Morning talks by our very own pastors will be based on Joseph, Nehemiah, and Daniel. Dr. Clem will focus on key passages in Deuteronomy and Joshua. I will do a brief survey of work in the New Testament and in the teachings of Jesus. In our theological focus, some of our messages will be more theological. We will first look at creation. How does creation relate to work? Our creation in God's image, and then on humanity's fall into sin. Dr. Clem will do creation, and I will do the fall into sin, and how these events shape work and the workplace. Then our series will end with how God's redemptive plan in Christ, His work of recreation, how does that relate to the mission of the church and work? And I understand we may have some breakout sessions as well to discuss some of these topics. How important is our work? In the various workplaces of our lives. There's much to say about the teachings of Jesus about work. I woke up the other morning. I have jet lag, so I don't know when it's morning or night. But I woke up, it was maybe 2 in the morning here. And I was thinking about this subject, and I was reminded of something. that we have very little of the sayings of Jesus in the Gospels that are quoted verbatim in the epistles. Very, very little. Now, the teachings of Jesus come through, but not by quotation. And there's only one place where an apostolic writer quotes the words of Jesus and calls it Scripture. It's only one place. And it's interesting, if you look at your notes, you will see that that place is a short statement made by Jesus related to work and workers. And that occurs in 1 Timothy 5, 17 and 18. It says this, "Let the elders who rule well," this is Paul to Timothy, "let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the Scripture says, Old Testament, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain." And here's the quotation from Jesus in the New Testament in Luke 10, verse 7. The Scriptures also say, now the words of Jesus, "The laborer or worker deserves his wages." Isn't that interesting? That what we have quoted from Jesus in the epistles is about workers. Now, of course, in the context of the pastorals, it's talking about those in ministry. Those in ministry are worthy of double honor. They're worthy, they should be paid properly. But the principle is based on the wider principle that if somebody works in the farm or works in the kitchen or works in the home or works in the hospital, they should be paid the proper wage. Jesus said that. And so Jesus is interested in the subject of work. And when we look at his teachings, we will find he often refers to laborers and workers. So as we see work matters much to Jesus, it should matter to us. May the Lord help us to reevaluate how we think about work of all kinds, and then do our work better for God's glory, and help others, those that we minister to think about work in a healthy way. So we wanted to make our theme verse Colossians chapter 3, or verses, Colossians 3, 23 to 24, which say this, and I quoted it here from the ESV, "Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You, all believers in all workplaces, you are serving the Lord." So may that be our theme as we consider this subject matter this week. In the morning we will begin with Dr. Clem's lecture on creation, and then in the evening on the fall, and then we will continue through the week on this subject. So may the Lord help us as we do our study together. Now what I would like to do for about 10 minutes is to show this short video of the story of Dan and Dot Ebert. And the purpose for showing it is twofold. One, so some of you will know the history of the ministry that we share together here. Maybe you have never seen this story before. But for all of us, that it would be an encouragement to us all the days of our life, until the Lord calls us home or until he returns, that we would live a life of long faithfulness. So let's, somebody can help me with the video. We'll try to get the sound so you can hear it, and then I'll pass it back to Pastor Tim.
Dan and Dot grew up in Pennsylvania, with Dan's family spending the summers at the Jersey Shore. As high school sweethearts, they attended the Church of the Open Door in Philadelphia. The young couple had given their lives to missions. They began their family and waited on the Lord for their field assignment. Dan studied Bible and then linguistics at the University of Wisconsin to prepare himself for translation work. Dot had told the Lord she would go anywhere in the world except Alaska or the Philippines. She would spend the next 55 years as a missionary in the Philippines, a land that she and Dan came to love. Here we can only briefly tell the story of their missionary adventures under three headings: the jungles, the city, and the hilltop. For the first 10 years of their missionary work, the Eberts lived in the mountain jungles on the island of Palawan in the southern Philippines, sometimes considered a part of Islamic Mindanao. Dan's work was not among the Moros, the seafaring coastal Muslims, though he had occasional contact with them, but among the animistic tribal people in the mountains. The Palawanos, who numbered some 20,000 people, had no written language, lived in isolation, and had never heard the gospel message. Dan and Dot, along with 3 foreign missionary ladies and a few Filipino missionaries, had come to bring them God's word. Dan was the lead translator and worked with a small team. They broke the language down phonetically, formed an alphabet, learned the language, and over a 10-year period translated the New Testament. Dan was often extremely sick with malaria and dysentery, as you can tell by how thin he looks. He pressed on in the work, not only translating, but also helping to teach and train the new believers. As happens from time to time on the mission field, there was a great turning to Christ. Tribal chiefs and witch doctors professed the gospel, and village after village turned to the Lord. Churches were established throughout the mountains, like this one on a mountain that used to be feared as the haunt of evil spirits. Meanwhile, Dot, who also was occasionally sick with malaria, was busy in her own heroic way. Like so many faithful missionary wives, she turned a difficult place into a home. Their nipa hut was where the children felt safe and loved. Dot kept the family well fed and could work wonders on very little. She traded with the tribal people for food and even found time to have another baby. Little Ethel Ann was loved by the Palawanos, who jokingly said, "We know you came in big sizes and little sizes, but we did not know you came in baby sizes too." In the early 1960s, the children had homeschooled before it was fashionable. Dan and Dot taught the children to love each other and the Lord. This too is a critical part of a missionary legacy. By 1964, the Palawano New Testament was ready for publication. Dr. Henry Waterman, a professional linguist from the American Bible Society, came and spot-checked it for accuracy and gave his stamp of approval. The Eberts moved to the city of Manila to oversee its final printing. Helen Boydston, a longtime co-worker, stacked the New Testament on the table, a handwritten copy on the left, and a copy in triplicates typed on the right, representing over 10 years of work. There are stories to be told here as well. The burning down of a large part of Chinatown, where the final proofs were initially stored, the sinking of the ship that took the first volumes to the island, and the final arrival of the New Testament in Palawan. It was the first New Testament to be translated and published after World War II, and Dan was made an honorary lifetime member of the American Bible Society. He knew it was a recognition that the whole team deserved. In the mid-1960s, Dan and Dot took an extended furlough to restore their health, visit with family and churches, and evaluate their future work in the Philippines. Dad had a growing burden to help develop church leaders, not only in Palawan, but throughout the Philippines. This would be an important transition time in their missionary service. The kids were growing up and said goodbye to their childhood playground in the jungles and prepared for life in the city. During their furlough, Dan and a fellowship of pastors and church leaders formed a new mission for the work ahead. It began as the Christian Translators Fellowship in 1966, and eventually, as the work of training national leaders developed, became the Christian Training and Missionary Fellowship. Dan continued to oversee the translation work in Palawan, in fellowship with New Tribes Mission, completing Old Testament portions, the Palawano hymn book, and other study material. But increasingly the work was shifting, along with senior Filipino pastors, to the training of national leaders for ministry and missions. For the next 10 years, Dan began to teach everywhere, often in very humble circumstances. He lectured at a small Bible institute, preached in local churches, taught at church conferences, and served as a mentor to younger pastors. He would often say, "Just teach the word and be faithful. God will bring in the harvest." Dot worked faithfully at Dan's side and holding the fort together at home. The children were growing up quickly, attending Faith Academy and soon going off to college. Dan continued teaching. He wrote Sunday school material, a doctrinal Bible study series, little commentaries on various books of the Bible, which often served as the basis of lectures at conferences. Dan's teaching ministry spread to Singapore, where he developed a strong relationship with several senior Chinese pastors. This would prove to be highly significant for the work in the Philippines in the years ahead. The teaching ministry was growing rapidly, but Dan's health was often not good. He struggled with allergies and occasional bouts of pneumonia, but help was on the way. In 1976, Dan IV graduated from Clearwater Christian College, and soon he, with their first two children, joined CTMF and arrived in the Philippines in 1977. Bill and Darla graduated from Tennessee Temple and arrived in 1980. Both couples raised their children on the field and worked together alongside their parents. Several important developments took place during this season. Dan continued to teach, write, and mentor young leaders. He wrote nearly 20 Bible study books, began a revision of the Pauline and New Testament, helped to further develop the Bible school, and guided the young men in the establishment of a fellowship of churches among graduates, and continued to build a good relationship with churches in Singapore. It was in Dan and Dot's home, which also doubled as the CTMF field headquarters, that Dan and his two sons launched a small graduate school called the Center for Biblical Studies. This was in 1985. Dan taught Biblical Hebrew and other courses. Dot, as always, kept everyone happy with good food. Dan's love for books had been contagious. The three missionary couples put their collections together, and this formed the start of the CBS library. Dan and Dot were always conscious that the Lord's work was a team effort. Many came to visit during those years, to help in the ministries and to bring encouragement. This truth is represented well by the visits of John and Bertie Sharp, who came to help with the expanding publication work. In every way, the missionary endeavor was growing. The printed ministry, the Bible conferences, the translation work, preaching and teaching in local churches, the growing graduate school, and the ongoing work at the Bible Institute. The missionary's relationship with leading Christian pastors in Singapore continued, as well as his teaching ministry there. At this time, Charles and Frida Seek came from Singapore to help the Eberts in the work as full-time missionaries. As this period drew to a close, the work was also facing significant challenges. Dan struggled with ongoing allergies and bouts of pneumonia. In part, this was a result of the hard days in Palau, but it was also due to the heavy pollution during his years of ministry in the city of Manila. The work was now scattered across the city, requiring much travel. The graduate school was in one place, the Bible Institute in another. The growing conferences moved from place to place each year, seeking rented facilities. The teachers at the graduate school and the Bible Institute were also scattered. Added to this was the challenge of life in the city. Even today, Metro Manila is listed among the top 10 most stressful cities in the world. The Bible Institute, which at this time was known as the Metro Manila School of the Bible, was meeting in cramped and rented office space in a congested part of the city. Dr. and Mrs. Steele from Clearwater, Florida, had visited and encouraged the missionary in his dream of a campus location. The brethren in Singapore were also in touch with the Eberts about just such a possibility. Rather quickly, the Lord did an amazing thing, which in some ways brought the ministries of Dan and Dot Ebert to a new phase, one which also situated the work for a future beyond their own lifetime. The ball started rolling in earnest when a concept design from some Christian architects at a large church in Singapore arrived. Dan IV happily shared the plans at a Monday prayer day with the fellowship. It was just a concept design, but it would soon lead to the Hilltop for Christ campus. What had been a dream would become a reality in a few short years. It was as if the Lord was blessing Dan and Dottie Ebert for their long season of faithfulness. The land was fully purchased by the end of 1990. There was a season of prayer and dedication. Dan's two sons led in the development of the campus. Dan IV chaired the construction committee, and Bill skillfully handled the finances. But the old missionary, though struggling physically, provided the much-needed leadership, inspiration, and wisdom. And in the Lord's providence, it was his connections with Singapore as well as with believers back in the U.S., that enabled the buildings to all be constructed without a penny of debt, from the day of groundbreaking in early 1992 till the last building was complete. The last years of Dan and Dot's missionary career were spent on what people affectionately refer to as the Hilltop for Christ. Dan preached and taught in the chapel. He lectured in the classroom block with its beautiful rock amphitheater and covered walkways, which were great for the rainy season. The lady students were like daughters to Dan and Dot, and they delighted to know that they could live in a dormitory eventually named after Helen Boydston, who had labored with them for so many years. The 3-story men's dorm would house young men who would continue to prepare for ministry for decades to come. Dan loved nothing better than encouraging these young men. And Dot enjoyed seeing that the students had a great place to eat, though she still loved having them up at the house for special treats. The Hilltop also has its own library, a flowering of the missionaries' love for books. The annual Bible conference, at which Dan had taught for so many years, now had its own place to meet. During this final decade, the missionary returned to his first love, Bible translation. Along with Crispin, his translation helper from the early days on the island, who was also himself now an old man, they revised and republished the Palawano New Testament. This was a great encouragement to the believers. Dan and Dot's missionary career was drawing to a close. They had to spend more and more time in the U.S., as Dan would recuperate from repeated bouts of pneumonia. He still made trips with Dot to the Philippines and Singapore to preach and teach, but these were less and less frequent. The work that they had guided all these years was now mature and poised for even further growth and effectiveness. They longed to be on the hilltop, but soon this was not possible. Dottie went home before Dan, though she had been the one who was rarely sick. 2 years later, Dan followed her. They left behind a legacy of missionary work that, Lord willing, will bear fruit for many years to come. Dan's last comment to his sons was his expressed desire to return to the Philippines just one more time. Anyway, he said, the work continues. Dottie's life verse was Jeremiah 33:3. Call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show thee great and mighty things which thou knowest not. The Lord had answered her prayers.